Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Thursday, March 6th, day 516 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here in our Jerusalem office with our legal reporter, Jeremy Sharon. Hi, Jeremy. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, Amanda. Good morning.
Good morning. Now, the Justice Minister is taking concrete steps to remove the Attorney General from office. We'll hear what they are and what happens now. We'll also learn about two new reports, one which alleges widespread abuse of Gazan medical personnel that were detained by Israeli forces, and the other that attempts to refute allegations of widespread famine in the Gaza Strip. All this and much, much more when we're back. Justice Minister Yariv Levin initiated proceedings to remove Attorney General Gali Baharav-Miara from office, and he has accused her of having politicized her office to thwart the will of the government. Levin has, of course, long threatened to take action against the Attorney General, and yesterday he sent letters to the Knesset Speaker and the Cabinet Secretary instructing them to fill the empty positions on the statutory committee for appointing and dismissing the Attorney General. So, Jeremy, is this the first time this has happened in Israeli history, or is it just in my recent history?
Yeah, it's just in your recent history. It hasn't happened. It did happen with one former Attorney General back in the 80s. He was forced out, essentially. I don't think the entire process went through to this final stage, but essentially he ended up being forced out of office. But it is pretty unprecedented and a pretty radical and extreme measure to take.
Of course, they've been threatening it for a long time, and there were rumors for probably even 2 years that this could happen. So what is the next step, or what are other steps that are involved in removing the Attorney General?
Okay, so essentially, you have to staff this 5-member committee, which is in charge of appointing and dismissing the Attorney General. So that's in terms of you have to put a member of Knesset on there. That's pretty easy. You also have to put a former Justice Minister or a former Attorney General on that committee, which is slightly harder because most of the former Justice Ministers and Attorney Generals would not be willing to participate in this, cooperate with the government on this. There are two former justice ministers, Gidon Saar and Amir Ochana, who might be willing to participate, but they've got jobs right now. Gidon Saar is the foreign minister and Amir Ochana is the Knesset speaker. And I've actually asked Levin's people and legal experts whether those two people can serve on the committee, and they're not clear about that yet. So it remains to be seen, how much of an obstacle that is. Once that committee is staffed, then the government can convene, discuss Levin's proposal, then forward his motion of no confidence to that committee. The committee then has to review the complaints, have a hearing for Baharav-Miara, and then come itself to a decision and whether or not to recommend that the government dismiss her, because as the government claims, the government and the Attorney General cannot work together. There's a fundamental breakdown in the relationship, or recommend that she not be fired. And after that recommendation, then the government has to make its own decision whether or not to. The government can, by the way, ignore the decision of the recommendation of the committee, and go ahead and fire her. Once that happens, then essentially she is fired. But if she is fired, there will inevitably be petitions against that decision to the High Court of Justice, and then you would have the process of judicial review over that government decision.
Okay, let me just try and understand what you just said. It was a lot. So it sounds as if there is this procedure to have this 5-person committee. One would be a member of Knesset, and that would be easy to find. Another has to be a former Justice Minister or a former Attorney General. There are 2 candidates that could be definitely in, Levin's pocket. And then there are 3 other members. Who are they?
Yeah, so the chairman is a former Supreme Court justice. Now, we already have one. He is appointed for a 4-year term, and that was back in 2022. So he's still in place. That's Asher Grunis. Interestingly, Asher Grunis actually did not support Baharav-Miara's appointment. We found that out about a year after she was appointed. But he's in position. Then there is a representative of the Israel Bar Association, and we also have a representative of Israel's academic legal faculties, and that person is also in position. So really the only two positions that need to be filled are the MK and the former justice minister or attorney general.
Okay, and if I understood what you just said properly, regardless of the decision of this committee, she can still be fired by the government.
That's correct.
Okay, so what is this committee for? Just to check a box then?
It is, as we said, quite a radical step to fire an attorney general. It's a very unprecedented thing to do. And if the government were to ignore the decision of the committee, let's say the committee says, we don't think there are grounds to fire the attorney general, then yes, the government can ignore the committee and go ahead and fire her. But when it comes to the petitions against the decision to the High Court of Justice, then the High Court will take a dim view of the government's decision if they rejected the committee's recommendation. Remember, the committee's recommendation is based on these are meant to be objective, non-political members of the committee. You've got a former Supreme Court justice, a former attorney general who's no longer, or theoretically shouldn't be in politics. The professional of the Israel Bar Association, an academic. So the High Court is going to look at these people and say, well, their objective view is to keep the Attorney General, and the government's view is, obviously very political because maybe the government doesn't like the fact that the Attorney General tells it to abide by the law. So then there is a high likelihood that the High Court would strike down the decision. And by the way, that would be based on the reasonableness principle, the famous or infamous reasonable principle, of which we obviously learned a lot in the past few years.
Right. And this leads us to, of course, a conversation about renewed efforts for the judicial overhaul. But before we get there, I just want to ask you, Jeremy, there are, of course, cases where people should be fired. There are cases in which the chemistry is not good, in which the working relationship isn't good. And no matter how qualified the person is, it's just not working out. So don't you think that the government should have this opportunity?
I think there's an interesting debate to be had on both sides of this issue. On the one hand, I think you can understand the government's frustration with Gali Baharav-Miara. She has opposed, the amount of time she's opposed the government is, I think, unprecedented. Levin himself noted that she's opposed the government on 14 occasions, as opposed to 2 occasions in the previous 6 years before her. And there has been some justification to Levin's complaints, which actually the High Court of Justice, when these issues have come to the court, has also upheld. So, for instance, the Attorney General opposed the government's decision to appoint an interim head for the Second Authority, that is a regulatory body for television and radio. So Baharav-Miara opposed this. When the case came before the High Court not only criticized her for opposing the decision, saying that there was no reason really for this person not to be appointed as the interim head, but also criticized her for failing to allow the government to obtain private counsel. And now this is something which Levin castigated Baharav-Miara for. Not only does she oppose the government's decisions, not only does she refuse to represent the government in the courts on those issues, which is another key aspect of her job, but she also has on several occasions refused to even allow them to have independent counsel. So that's one example. There was another example of an appointment which she opposed, and I could give you other examples. For instance, the recusal law. That was an important law determining how the Prime Minister can be required to recuse himself from office. The government passed that law. The Attorney General opposed it. Levin pointed out that the Knesset legal advisor actually did not oppose it. So when you're talking about this whole issue of how the Attorney General and the government can work together, I think there is a fair expectation on behalf of the government that the Attorney General do work hard to find ways to uphold their positions and uphold and advance their policies. Whereas Levin and the government see that Baharav-Miara has worked in the opposite direction. and pointing out that the Knesset legal advisor found it fit to support this law, is an important example of that. Now, actually, the High Court eventually said that law cannot come into effect because it was too narrowly applicable to Netanyahu. But they didn't strike down the essence of the law, and Baharav-Miara opposed all aspects of that law. So I think that's another important example here of how she hasn't worked with the government. On the other hand, I think you can also perhaps make a case that if there has been a record number of times in this current government that the Attorney General has opposed its policies and appointments and legislation, maybe that also is reflective of the kind of policies and legislation and appointments the government is making. So, we know that the Attorney General opposed the government's judicial overhaul laws, which would have radically constrained the judiciary, removed checks and balances from Israel's form of government. She has opposed the government's efforts to circumvent its obligations to draft ultra-Orthodox men into the military after the High Court ruled that they must be drafted. The Attorney General hasn't responded yet, but in a previous round where Levin has sent letters to her, denouncing her and so on, she said, I'll quote here, she said that she saw it as her professional duty to warn the government of steps which contravene the law. And that she, that's part of her task of assisting the government in achieving its policies within the boundaries of the law. So, as I said, I think there's two sides to this. I think this government has pushed the boundaries of what is acceptable under the terms of Israeli law. But on the other hand, perhaps Gali Baharav-Miara hasn't worked as hard as she could to allow the government to advance policies which might not be so so severely violate Israeli law, or if they violate Israeli law at all. And I think some of the examples we mentioned are good proof of that.
Exactly. And as you alluded to, hackles are raised because this government has tried to bulldozer through all sorts of reforms, including what you talked about, the reasonableness. I don't know how you would even call it, the reasonableness issue that Supreme Court justices can use in order to adjudicate their cases. But one other new law is the ombudsman law, and it changes essentially how the state ombudsman for judges is chosen, and it passed its third and final reading in the Knesset plenum on Tuesday morning very early, following a full night of debate. And the controversial legislation was sponsored by, again, Religious Zionism MK Simcha Rotman, and it's widely seen as giving lawmakers a greater say in how the justice system is run. So tell us very briefly a little bit about this ombudsman law and why it is so game-changing in a way.
Yeah, so the ombudsman is the official who is responsible for managing complaints against judges and managing the fallout of those complaints, the disciplinary process, and recommending to the Judicial Selection Committee whether or not they should be fired or whether any sanctions should be taken against those judges. So until now, the system was that the Justice Minister, representing the government, together with the President of the Supreme Court, representing the judiciary, obviously, they would have to agree on a candidate or a couple of candidates, and they would submit that candidate to the Judicial Selection Committee, and the Judicial Selection Committee would make a decision. So here you've got a situation where you've got two branches of government involved in this process of appointing someone who's really an important figure, because if that figure has to be balanced and see everyone and see the judges he's dealing with in an equitable manner. He has to deal with them in a fair manner. Otherwise, as the opposition have expressed, this process of disciplinary action against judges could be weaponized on a political basis. So formerly you had a balance between the government and the judiciary. Now the situation is that there's a special committee which is set up, which the coalition controls. I won't go into all the details of who is on the committee, but essentially the coalition has an automatic majority on this committee. So now, instead of having a balance, we've got a situation where the coalition, essentially the government, is in control of this very sensitive and delicate position. And that's another example of how this government is seeking to rebalance or tip the scales in favor of government control and authority over all of Israel's branches of government, to the detriment of the judiciary and of checks and balances on governmental and legislative authority.
Let's go to a short break. And we're back. A new report by the Physicians for Human Rights Israel organization, which advocates for Palestinian human rights, has found that Gazan medical personnel detained by Israeli forces and held in Israeli detention facilities during the war with Hamas were subjected to widespread and severe abuse, including beatings, different forms of torture, psychological abuse, medical neglect, and the provision of insufficient rations. These are all allegations coming from testimonies provided by the prisoners themselves. So the IDF and prison service has, of course, denied the allegations, and the report is based on testimony provided by 24 detainees to these lawyers, the PHRI lawyers, who were able to visit the individuals in the military detention centers or Israel prison service facilities where they were being held. So the testimonies were given in these Israeli prison facilities. Jeremy, the question always is, how credible is this report? Is it purely and only based on word of mouth, on testimonies, or is there any kind of physical evidence for these allegations as well?
So all of the personnel who Physicians for Human Rights interviewed were still incarcerated at the time of their interview. Only one has been released now. So we don't have photographs or of their injuries, or photographs or videos of their conditions. But we do know that so far 6 Israeli reserve soldiers have been indicted for severe abuse and injuring Palestinian detainees in some of these facilities, specifically State Teman, and those indictments include beatings, stabbings, humiliation, and other crimes. And so we know that we have that evidence so far. And we also have numerous other reports by other organizations. I've actually in the middle of reviewing other testimony taken by another Israeli organization called Hamoked, and I've reviewed about 20 testimony so far taken by Hamoked's lawyers, also visiting these people in their detention facilities. And, that testimony is strikingly similar to the testimony given to the Physicians for Human Rights lawyers. We've also had media reports about similar claims of such abuses. And we've had reports by the B'Tselem organization, also based on testimony by Human Rights Watch and by a Palestinian NGO called Healthcare Workers Watch. All of these reports have been based on testimony, and I think there is definitely a pattern coming out which reflects a serious concern that there has been severe abuses of Palestinian detainees in detention, and I think that we should take these reports seriously.
Okay, let's turn to another report. And from almost the very beginning of the war, there were periodic reports on the food security situation in Gaza, asserting even in early and late 2024 that famine was either imminent or had already taken hold in parts of the territory. So immediately, pretty much, Israeli academics and public health officials began questioning the accuracy and reliability of these reports from May 2024, highlighting how the estimates made by these organizations appear to ignore key information about aid supply and use data from questionable sources. So recently, the UK Lawyers for Israel reviewed the issue, and they published last week a report that highlighted these criticisms. And according to this organization, obviously a pro-Israel organization, it's in the name, the UK Lawyers for Israel, the pro-Israel organization found that there was no famine in Gaza during the war as defined by IPC standards, an international standard. And even levels of acute malnutrition were only marginally higher than pre-war figures. So again, same question. How credible is this report, Jeremy?
Okay, so yes, the UK Lawyers for Israel, as you said, in the name, might not be the most objective of organizations when it comes to these kind of allegations. But what the organization did was review some of the claims made by academics and also Israeli public health officials during the war about the claims made by the IPC and the USAID's FuseNet about alleged famine. And it was simply reviewed, and this is something which I myself have done. I've written about it, and you can find those reports on our website about how the claims made by these nutrition organizations about famine were not borne out by the data, and how in fact in the earlier reports of these organizations, of IPC and of FuseNet, were they retracted essentially to a certain extent their claims of famine later on in the war, and then they made them again, and then we find once more that those are based on problematic data. So, for instance, the IPC in March, the IPC is connected to the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization. So the IPC wrote that there was nearly 700,000 people in phase 5 catastrophe level of famine. That's the highest phase that IPC defines. And that there should be 135 people dying every day between March and June of 2024. We never saw those figures. We never saw data to back that kind of death rate up, and no one has ever published that data. We do think the World Food Programme of the UN and perhaps other organizations does have the data, but it is still yet to be published. And we also found, like I said, that a lot of these reports or central claims of these reports were based on erroneous information, or they were based on information which was lacked a comprehensive overview. So, for instance, one of the reports alleging famine said that there was insufficient food, but it completely failed to understand that it didn't take into account that there was commercial imports of food as well as humanitarian aid going in. So there was enough food for the population, and as a result, there was no starvation. So they just failed to understand how much food was actually going in. And there was other similar failures, like you said. They misdefined the amount of malnutrition in Gaza before the war, and so they said it was much lower before the war than it really was, and so during the war they say, well, it's now much higher, but that was based on an erroneous assumption to start with. They also, in another key failing of one of the reports, was that it said there must be mass starvation in northern Gaza because the amount of food we see going in is not commensurate with the population there. But they underestimated the population size by some 50 or 60,000 people. So they thought there were 70,000 people in northern Gaza, and the reality was there was between 5 and 10,000 people. So obviously there was their understanding of how much food was needed in that region was completely not commensurate with reality. So as I said, there's been no data to show that excess mortality, other than from traumatic death from war, represents anything like a famine. And what the UK Lawyers for Israel organization pointed out is that we haven't got that data. It's never been published. Data on the excess mortality rate has not been published, and therefore these claims of famine are really cannot be relied on at the moment. Why is all this important, by the way? Because these claims of famine are key to some of the legal processes against Israel in the International Court of Justice. where there's the genocide allegations against Israel based specifically on starving the Palestinian population in Gaza, and also the arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. The key allegations there are not the only allegations, but the key allegations are of crimes against humanity by Israel taking a policy of starving the Palestinian population. And Karim Khan, the prosecutor of the ICC, actually quoted some of these reports saying that, there's 1.1 million people starving in Gaza. That's a statistic directly lifted from these reports. But it turns out, that 1.1 million figure was grossly inaccurate. And there is, as I said, very little data about starvation in Gaza. So, I'm following up on this and trying to dig down further into the available data that we do have. And I think this is a very important review of what is really a very damaging and severe allegation, which severely harmed Israel during the conduct of this war.
Listeners, we will have links to Jeremy's reporting on both of these reports in our program notes. Jeremy, thank you so much for your updates and insights today.
You're welcome, Amanda.
Thank you for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.